Hello, and welcome to the Soul Shaking Love podcast. I am your host, Valerie Green from CoachValerieGreen.com. And this podcast is really dedicated to bringing you expert teachers to help you to feel that mind, body, and spirit connection, both with yourself and with your true love. And that's what we're going to be talking today with my guest, Jonathon 𝐀𝐬𝐥𝐚𝐲𝐬, and he is one of the top midlife dating coaches in the world. So I'm so excited to have him here. Hi, Jonathon.
Hey, Valerie, thanks for having me on.
You're welcome. And so Jonathon wrote a book called What the Heck is Self-Love Anyway? So let me tell you a little bit about him, because I think that his approach is really unique and integrative. I read his book myself, and I just knew that I had to bring him on the show. So, like I said, Jonathon is one of America's leading midlife dating coaches. He specializes in working with women. I'm 46, so if I was single, I would be his ideal client. And I have been divorced, and I had to learn all of these lessons in self-love in order to grieve and learn from my mistakes the first time around and be happily married now as well. And so that's one of the reasons I think that his book has all the right information. And also, after, my heart goes out to you, Jonathon, still, because it's so hard to get over losing a teenage son. And your son, Connor, passed away in 2018. And so Jonathon's grief led him on a soul searching journey where he really became aware of the importance of self-love, and especially how it relates to dating. And that dating brings up, as we know, all of our lack of self-worth, all of our lack of self-regard and self-love. And so that is what he decided to focus on, is how to use dating as a practice to find and reprogram those blocks that we have to self-love. And if we don't do that, it's going to come up anyway. And then also how to use that in our grieving process, and why that's important after a breakup. And, so those are the topics. And also how that's really important to be able to see the red flags when you first meet somebody, that if you don't have self-love, then you can't really drop into your own intuition to identify those those red flags, because we'll be asking, does this person like me, rather than are they really compatible? So those are going to be the focus of today's talk. So I'm really excited to dive in, Jonathon.
Well, I'm excited to be here. So fire away.
Yes. And I love just, even the people on YouTube that are watching. I think it's focused on my video, but when you see him, you can see that his body posture is relaxed and his heart is open. And, I can just tell that you embody all of these self-love practices yourself.
Thank you.
So wonderful. So first of all, I think our audience is probably wondering, how do you define self-love? And then how do you know if you're not loving yourself? I think those are the two probably top questions that everybody has.
Oh, this is so complicated. No, I'm kidding. The way I look at it, and I want to share with everyone, this is just the way I view it. I'm not saying this is the right or wrong way, but I invite everyone to lean into how this resonates with them. So the way I look at self-love is all the self-words: self-worth, self-esteem, self-confidence, self-reliance, self-discipline, all of those things that we do to nurture ourselves. And it's just encapsulated in the word love, because love is a beautiful, grand word. And it's really about empowering and embodying your true being, your true essence, your divinity, that sort of thing. That's what I envision is self-love. And it's probably easier to look at self-love when we're not loving ourselves, when we are crucifying ourselves, when we have self-judgment, self-doubt, lack confidence. It's all those experiences that invite us to actually nurture our own soul, as if you are the child and the parent inside of you is taking care of the little child that's hurting inside of you. That's the way I incorporate self-love. And when I wrote my book, Quite frankly, everybody, it's a very simplistic way of looking at it. It is not this deep dive like The Untethered Soul by Michael Singer. It's more like the I'm going to say elementary version of it. But the principles in the book are about self-empowerment. And much like when the flight attendant, when you're on an airplane, tells you, in the case of cabin pressure change, oxygen masks will be dropped from the ceiling. And if you're traveling with a small child, put the mask on yourself first.
Mm-hmm.
That's in essence what self-love is putting the oxygen mask of love on yourself, you know, so you don't suffocate in life, kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
And that might be a simplistic way of looking at the book.
Well, yeah, I mean, I love what you just said because I agree that your book is, I want to say, kind of simple or streamlined. However, it points out these concepts that are not necessarily easy to implement. Like, for example,
Yeah.
it's really easy to say, oh, the next time I make a mistake, I'm not going to beat myself up. I'm going to look at it as a learning opportunity. I'm going to give myself compassion, and I'm going to look at, oh, I'm not going to beat myself up. I'm understanding the reasons I did that. And then here's what I do differently next time. And I'm looking at it as learning. Like, how easy is that to do? Not so much. Not if our programming is about beating ourselves up, right?
Yeah. Well, I think of it also in the context of, practice makes perfect. And what I mean to say is, if somebody is learning how to play the piano, and I know for some people it's very natural and it's probably easy for them, but I would say for the vast majority of humans, it's a very complicated instrument to learn. And how you learn is through repetition, doing the same thing, same scales, same this, same that, over and over and over and over again, and ingraining it inside of one's being. And eventually, if you actually become really attuned to it, you can even go beyond the simplistic of a music sheet and riff from that. If you've been gifted to some degree, but also if you've practiced. And I think it's the same with self-love. The challenge most humans have is the way they look at personal development, self-help, and spiritual work. And I know that sounded judgmental, what I just said, but I do believe what I'm saying is many people feel like, well, let me go to one workshop and I'll be healed, or I'll work with a therapist once and I'll be healed. Much like that farmer who puts a seed in the ground and wakes up the next morning going, why isn't there a tree in my backyard, kind of thing. It's the repetition and the practice and the noticing and actually just even being a witness to your life. In other words, your life, if you were on stage and you were living your life, to be able to take yourself outside, sit in the audience and witness yourself takes a tremendous amount of awareness. I mean, we're talking almost ninja level type of awareness. And it takes time and practice and experiences to get there. And as you shared in my bio, the reason why I incorporate this in my dating or coaching business is because nothing triggers our stuff, in my opinion. I mean, dating and relationships don't have to be romantic. Family relationships can trigger, or our professional relationships can trigger our stuff like nobody's business.
Right, totally.
And what I mean by our stuff is the most common emotional health wound is I'm not good enough, I'm not lovable, I'm not likable. I mean, that's the most common emotional health wound most everybody is experiencing.
Mm-hmm.
So, learning to put that oxygen mask on yourself first. First, you have to even be aware that there is an oxygen mask, and then how to find it, how to put it on, how to strap it. I mean, these are all little, I mean, I know that sounds kind of intuitive, but the reality is it's not intuitive to love oneself.
Yeah. I mean, it's true. Our eyes point outwards, not inwards. So it's much easier to look outside of ourselves for love, meaning validation, approval, acceptance, compassion, empathy, rather than give that to ourselves. It's just easier because our senses perceive things outwardly much easier than they do things inwardly. And so I completely agree with what you're saying. And also, if our programming, was like, if we had parents that really created secure attachment, that's wonderful. I personally don't identify as that. I've had to do a lot
You
of.
You don't identify as what? Just out of curiosity.
Having inherent secure attachment. I think I have an earned secure attachment at this point. But, for example, like my upbringing made me really codependent. And I had to, in my early 20s, I would always look at, does the other person like me? I have to make myself into what I think the other person wants me to be. That's how I'll get love. And so I had to do a lot of healing work myself, which is why when I read your book, I was like, yes, these are all the things that I agree with, because, obviously I'm here to interview you on the practices, but I'm just validating that if our childhood programming makes it easier for us to take care of others than to take care of ourselves first, then it's not intuitive. It doesn't come naturally or easily to us, but the brain is neuroplastic. We can learn. We can rewire it. And so that's what your book talks about, is like how to look at your limiting beliefs, how to take a step back and have that higher perspective, right? So do you want to share a little bit more about that?
So I actually, while you were sharing, I brought up some notes that I wasn't prepared to share, but I would like to, because, I think of, I believe you use the word imprinting, or what, in early childhood. And I think that's a great conversation place to look at, because you even acknowledge that you had experienced more of a codependent upbringing in your life. And most people experience either codependence, counterdependence. Very few people actually experience interdependence as a programming or imprinting in their childhood.
Mm-hmm.
I look at imprinting or scripts that we learned much like coding for a program, like for a computer program. And I share this because my son is learning to be a coder. And, when he's writing code, there's all this lines of stuff. I don't, there are X's and O's and plus, all different types of stuff.
Right.
and I want to just give this example for everyone. We have to recognize that we have this inherent code that's came back to our Neanderthal cave people days, where we have this coding that says we are either, provider, protectors, nurturer, gatherers. That's one line of script or coding. And then we have our biological coding. We have our hormones, our pheromones, our biological, particularly the differences between men and women, the estrogen or testosterone. And even within each gender, there's variations within that. And then there's socialization that happens, certainly for those who grew up here in the United States, there's a level of socialization that, and certainly was different for the baby boom generation versus the current generation of younger people. There's even different scripting going on. And then there's the childhood imprinting you just discussed, which is also known as childhood wounds. It's also known as imago, which is where we oftentimes in a romantic relationship pick people that are similar to one or both of our parents. And there's also love attachment style, which to some degree, codependent people are known as anxious, or counterdependent people are known as avoidance. And then, so right off the bat, we have all this coding.
Exactly.
And there's a lot of stuff there.
Right.
and so, a lot of that, that's why I'm not a big fan of characterizing certain things as masculine or feminine, because each human being's had a unique, different experience in just this base level of coding. Then we have to look at the coding of your age, your life experience, your culture, your religion, your socioeconomic, your education, your physical health. All of this is more coding to make up who you are as a person. And then are you even an introspective person to be able to understand everything I just said?
Right. I know it is very complex.
Oneself. And then when it comes to human pair bonding, what is your emotional IQ? How really truly are you self-aware to know your fears, your insecurities, your judgments of others, your negative patterns, your limiting belief, how your actions affect other people? And even those things that bring you pain. This is where self-awareness, to be able to be the observer of your life and then be able to articulate. Here's another thing, Valerie. Just because you feel your feelings, and most people don't even understand what they are feeling when they're experiencing feelings, but
Right.
then to be able to articulate it in a way that can actually be seen, heard, and understood by another human being. This requires ninja level communication experience.
It's true. And
Most
that's
of us
all of
haven't.
us need to have in order to have a successful long-term relationship. But as you're saying, what we need to do is to have the self-awareness to go deep within ourselves and understand what we're feeling and why we're feeling it and what we're needing. And then to be able to communicate that with another person in a way with an open heart where we are then compassionately curious about what they're feeling and needing. That is an art that hardly anybody learns, from their parents or from their school, that we all have to then learn as adults. And that's a huge part of self-love.
A few weeks ago, I was having a conversation with, I'll call it a friend, but it was more like an acquaintance. And in this interaction, there was a bit of contention between us. And now, I want to say something publicly. I mean, I do this for a living and I'm, immersed in it, and I'm still scratching the ant's belly at effective communication because I got defensive with this person.
Oh yeah, happens to the
best. And quite frankly, it's because I actually did get attacked. I didn't. Now, she then criticized me for not hearing her, but she didn't take ownership by recognizing that she actually attacked me in her form of communication. I got defensive. It turned into kind of a tug of war. And now in her mind, she was just seeking some acknowledgement of what she was going, but the way she directed it towards me was actually confrontational.
Right.
And my point is just now I can look back now after the fact, examine it, and I go, wow, I didn't honor my feeling of being attacked. I immediately just naturally got defensive. I didn't say, ouch, what you said hurt, and let me tell you why it hurt. I immediately argued that she was wrong. And my point is we're talking about really sophisticated understanding of emotions and then communicating it. Now let me tell you, I could beat myself up for this lack of awareness, or I could just say, thank you, universe, for this lesson to observe this the next time, and then in practice that self-love, because in a way I did beat myself up afterward for not being aware enough to get it. Do you see how like nuanced, complicated this is?
I do, which is why I think that your book might be simple, but it's not easy, because what you're talking about incorporates a lot of the principles of your book together. It's having that self-awareness. It's having the courage to be vulnerable in that moment, where if you were in that moment embodying self-love, which, it's not like you knew you weren't, but you were, less aware in that moment, and awareness is part of self-love, that you could have been vulnerable and said something like, I want to hear what you have to say, but I'm feeling defensive. I feel attacked right now, and I want to hear what you have to say. Could you please rephrase that in a way where you're not attacking me? And that would have been you embodying self-love. But then afterwards, also embodying self-love would have been looking at it as compassionate curiosity as to why you didn't do that, and then seeing it as a learning opportunity. And, it sounds like you eventually did get there, but it's not easy to get there. It required you to reframe how you were thinking about it.
It's interesting. This is kind of the story of my experience. I like the way Wayne Dyer tells the story, my autobiography, in 5 short chapters. Chapter 1, you're walking down a street, there's a deep hole in the sidewalk, you fall in, you're lost, you're helpless, you claim it isn't your fault, it takes forever to get out. Chapter 2, you walk down the same street, there's a deep hole in the sidewalk, you fall in, you're lost, you're in the same place, but it isn't your fault, still takes a long time to get out. And I'm doing the Cliff Note version of this. Chapter 3, you're walking down the street, there's a deep hole in the sidewalk. You see it there. You fall in. It's a habit. It's your fault or responsibility. You get out quickly. Chapter 4, you're walking down the street. There's a deep hole in the sidewalk. You walk around it. And chapter 5, you walk down another street. Okay, for this long analogy, I do find that I will fall into the hole, if you will. And it's the awareness that it's my fault. In other words, it's my responsibility. You know, the old version of me would have blamed the reason why I got defensive and blamed the other person. It's because I took no ownership. It took me, I fell in just like I still got defensive, but I got out and said, oh, wait a minute. I reacted this way because this happened. And when I was able to articulate that, we were able to kind of have a meeting of the minds in this particular case. And then she also was able to take ownership of her part because it wasn't her intent to use confrontational communication, which there's a great book by Marshall Rosenberg called Nonviolent Communication that I recommend everybody read. It should have been titled Compassionate Communication, but the reason why it's titled Nonviolent is we oftentimes communicate in a very confrontational way.
Yes.
Hence why people get defensive.
Yep. Yes, I love nonviolent communication. It's one of my top modalities. And I believe the reason that it's called nonviolent communication as well is because it was really evolved in the desegregation movement, where there was in the US in the 1960s, where there was a lot of violence. But I think it's kind of a misnomer, because I completely agree. People think, oh, I don't need to learn that, I'm not violent. Well, are you getting into arguments with anyone? And do you get defensive when you're attacked, or when you perceive that you're attacked? Or are you critical? Well, then it's more loving to yourself and more compassionate to yourself and others if you can learn how to share your feelings and needs and listen to the other person's feelings and needs. And that's what it's all about.
Well, I could be mistaken, but I believe that Marshall Rosenberg, and I could be mistaken because I've heard this, like the telephone game. I think he even acknowledged that 20 years later, he had wished he had titled it like Compassionate Communication.
Yes.
Because the way he entered into writing the book, and again, I view it more, he probably was thinking of confrontational communication,
right?
Or the facts of what you shared earlier. But for those listening to this right now, I highly recommend it because it's all about compassionate communication for yourself and for those that you're communicating to.
Exactly. Yeah. And self-compassion is a huge part of self-love. I mean, do you want to hear more about what that looks like? Like, how do you know if you have self-compassion versus self-judgment? And then how can you catch yourself when you're judging yourself? Because I think a lot of people think that if I'm compassionate with myself, then I won't learn. But the opposite is actually true. It actually takes self-compassion to learn, because if you're blaming yourself, then that actually prevents us from learning. So do you want to speak about that?
No, this is a great topic. And I don't profess to be the expert in this particular case. I am actually, I witness my own life and I share from a lot of my own personal experiences, just because I can't necessarily get inside the head of somebody else. It seems to me where I beat myself up the most is whenever, for one, because I'm public, I'll get a lot of negative comments on the things that I do. And sometimes when I read something, it triggers the wound of I'm not good enough, I'm not lovable. And my wounds are I'm not smart. I have a wound that, that there's a script inside of me that says I'm stupid. And
Mm,
so I'll get triggered in that, when someone, and legitimately, let's just say there's someone attacking me. And I'm saying, let's just say within the online scheme.
right.
And yet there's a part of me that believes that they're right. That, and so then I get into this self-judgment, and it takes that real consciousness not to fall into the victim experience, and we victimize ourselves just as much as we feel like a victim from
Oh
someone
yeah.
else.
Hmm.
And it takes just that awareness to go, you know what? Ouch, that hurt. Okay. At the same time, I know my worth. And that
Yeah.
takes a tremendous amount of repetitive practice to come back and say, I know my worth, I know my worth, I know my worth. Even though there is a programming inside, there's code that literally says you're worthless, that goes back
Mm,
to in my childhood where my mother would incessantly tell me I was worthless.
yeah.
And she didn't mean to do it. I know, my mother didn't mean to give me all these scripts, and my father didn't mean to give me all these scripts or
Oh yeah,
coding.
of course, I'm sure. But at
But
the
at the
same
same
time, they went in anyway.
yeah,
Parents are
and
stressed.
it's there.
They're just doing what was done to them. It's not their fault either. But at the same time, you're right. It's there. And so then
So
what do you do with it?
there's something else you might find interesting. This is a new theory I've been working on, and when I say theory, it's just a perception, and I just haven't been able to collaborate with anyone to see if my perception is relatively true. So that's why it's not a theory; it's just a perception. You mentioned earlier you're codependent.
Well,
So
I was. I didn't think I have
oh,
any
was. Excuse me.
with
I
my
apologize.
pregnancy.
Was codependent. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. Well, I do believe that whatever our default is, it exists. We just may not, there's still residue
Oh, of course,
of
yes.
anxious or avoidant. And let's reframe it as anxious or avoidant. I think we all have a default in one of those.
Yeah, although what I
Um,
do want to say is just to be clear, because
yeah.
I have studied a lot of the psychology, and of course, I believe you're smart, and I believe you know this, but I just want to make sure from the audience, codependent versus interdependent is not the same thing as anxious avoidant. There's a lot of overlap. Like
Yes.
codependents tend to have anxious attachment, but it's not the same thing. So I just want to be clear. I don't
No,
want
and I appreciate
it.
that. And really, attachment theory was birthed from codependent, interdependent, counterdependent, experiences. So, and I just wanted only because I wanted to shift to anxious and avoidant. But
Yes, yes, yes.
um,
So let's talk about that
okay,
instead. I just want to make sure
okay,
we're not saying they're the same exact thing. But anyway, yes, go
but there's a
on.
lot of crossover. So, with that said, I believe that avoidance who are in relationship with anxious people oftentimes heal within the relationship
Yeah. Mhm.
because the anxious or the avoidant person who has a really difficult time experiencing love when they're given love up until the point where it's too much,
Right.
they actually are healing within that experience, but they still oftentimes end the relationship
Right.
if they're not self-aware to know that they have this pattern, which is usually centered around not being very emotionally expressive within a relationship. Avoidants tend to be they are very limiting in their capacity to be emotionally expressive.
Right.
Okay, put that in a box for a moment. Now take the anxious person. I think the anxious person does their healing when the relationship ends because now they're
Mhm.
experiencing the abandonment, they're experiencing the rejection, and this is the opportunity for them to do the healing. So, and this is just again a perception I have. It kind of sucks for the anxious person because their healing comes after the fact, while the
Mhm.
avoidant person gets an opportunity to rewire themselves within the relationship. Um, and
Yeah.
I only say this because the anxious person tends to go through a lot more emotional trauma. And again, this is just a perception. because they feel now abandoned. And this is where self-love is so imperative in the
Yes,
healing process.
totally. And yeah, no, I agree with you that like in that classic anxious avoidant dating um cycle that gets set up,
Yeah.
the avoidant usually ends the relationship and the anxious person then has to grieve and
Yeah.
feel abandoned and then have to heal in that process. And so what do you recommend? What are the steps that the person who feels abandoned in a breakup can do to heal and experience self-love rather than feel victimized? And
Oh, this is a great question. So, when I'm working with a client in my boot camp coaching program, which it's kind of cheesy. It's called Shortcut to Mr. Right. I'm just owning it, but a lot of it's
yeah,
inner work. One of
right.
the exercises is that there's 4 questions that I'm inviting each client to ask themselves, and I'll share with everybody here today. Question number 1: what positive things about yourself did you learn in this experience? What positive things about yourself did you learn in this experience or relationship? Question number 2: how have you healed a wound from this relationship? How have you healed a wound? Now, you have to even be aware that there is a wound that exists to be able to answer that question. Maybe
Right.
go to a therapist to get some feedback on it, but certainly invite, how have I healed from this experience? Number 3, identify everything that was good about the relationship. I believe that every relationship has some really good, juicy parts to them. So identify them. And then 4, which is really the other side of the coin to the third question, is what are you most grateful for? Gratitude is a powerful love tool to nurture one's soul. Gratitude is an incredibly powerful, I use the term tool, but it's really it's a choice of experience. And when you can be grateful instead of victimized, which many people have a relationship ending, and it's pointing the finger at the other person as if you're the victim. And
Mm-hmm.
victim consciousness will keep you stuck in a cycle for a very long time. So
Right.
these 4 questions, which might be very difficult to do, because let me just be clear, the ending of a treasured relationship is a death. It must be treated no different than the physical death, because there's an emotional death that happens when 2 people separate, from a romantic relationship. And
Yeah.
it's important to go through the grieving process. It's important to, you know, examine particularly anger that may come about, depression that may come about. Oftentimes, a lot of people go straight to acceptance without really, and they're spiritually bypassing the feelings of depression, bargaining, shock,
Right.
um,
Exactly. And I would
and
say more
anger.
avoidance tend to avoid those feelings. The
Yes.
anxious person tends to get overwhelmed by them.
And sometimes in that overwhelm, they still have a capacity to stuff their feelings,
Mm-hmm.
and
Right. Right.
that's why it's important. And let me just say this: I'm a big proponent of somatic therapy,
Mm-hmm.
energy release work. I did something known as the Hoffman process, which is a deep dive using emotional release work to heal negative patterns and limiting beliefs. And I can say this: when a treasured relationship ends, it's a stab in the heart.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but it doesn't necessarily mean you need open heart surgery,
Right.
because that's what self-love is there to do for you, is to nurture your soul so you're better prepared for hopefully the next experience you have.
Yeah, that's really well said. I think that a lot of people try to rush the grieving process and get into a rebound relationship, and then they get attached,
Yes.
and then that also helps them to stuff the feelings of grief. But
Yeah.
it's actually kind of an escape from that process. And so I love those questions that you shared. And then, being willing to feel those feelings is not easy, but if we don't, then we're not really then truly open for the next relationship. And piggybacking on that is the question of a lot of reasons that people do blame the other person is because they're not taking responsibility for recognizing the red flags that were there from the beginning that showed that the other person was avoidant, for example. And so, what are the early signs that you're in the wrong relationship? And then, why do we need self love in order to follow those signs?
You know, this is a very tough question to answer. So I'm inviting everybody, everyone listening to this right now. If you're single and you're putting yourself out in the dating marketplace, I believe that most human beings have suffered some emotional trauma in the form of a previous relationship. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think we all get unscathed. For some people, they might have been in a happy marriage and it ended with the loss of a spouse might be one form of ending relationship. A person might have been in a toxic relationship. A person might have been in a relationship where the two people had a very loving relationship, but they were misaligned with one another on their life vision or something else. Or maybe they had residue from their past that is gone unhealed. I believe the question to ask everybody is ask them which one of their previous relationships hurt the most, and then ask them, how have you healed from that?
Mm-hmm.
And depending on how somebody answers will give you the level of depth they have. And certainly if they answer it in a combative tone,
Mm-hmm.
chances are that's not a good sign. Okay.
Yep, exactly.
If they
Red flag.
answer in a dismissive tone, that's not a good sign.
Yep.
Okay. So if it's contentious, if it's dismissive, that's not a good sign. If somebody answers that question with a fair amount of depth,
right,
that's a good sign that this person has some EQ.
Yep.
Because here's the thing. Good people can hurt other people unintentionally. Let me repeat that. Good people can hurt people unintentionally. There is a good person may not be aware of what their true needs are in a relationship. And the minute they enter into a relationship, they might go down the rabbit hole for several months, if not several years, only to find out that they didn't have the capacity to really embrace emotional intimacy. And they end the relationship. Well, they ended it. There's a collateral damage to the person who doesn't want that relationship ending, right?
Yeah,
There's an emotional, but I don't think the person intended for that consequence. Now, yes, there are users out there. There are people that are, very self-serving. And usually you can spot those people just, most people that are self-serving lack generosity. And I don't mean paying for dinners kind of generosity. I mean, they just lack generosity in their life. It's kind of a fundamental barrier for people that are disingenuous.
Yeah, well, I would say they lack emotional generosity because,
yes, I'm sorry. Thank you for clarifying.
Can be very generous with their actions and with their words of praise. But if you try to be vulnerable or, establish a loving boundary, then they won't have it. And so it's like they're not emotionally generous. So I completely agree with you that we need to learn how to vet people's emotional intelligence.
And I'm glad you clarified that because in my mind, I thought that's what I was saying. But it's emotional generosity, but more importantly, genuine appreciation.
Right.
I just noticed that people that are, they're both the camps of self-serving people, truly self-centric, and I mean self-centric, self-serving, selfish. We can even throw in the term narcissist in there, tend to lack genuine appreciation and also emotional generosity. Put that in a box for a second.
Mm-hmm.
Now, there's a population of truly wounded human beings who have done little or no, very little personal development, self-help, spiritual work, or therapy to heal from their past relationships. So their capacity to be in relationship is is less than their pains and hurts from their past. In other words, their capacity is, well, I'm if I'm anyone can see my hands, they're here, and the pain and hurt is here. In other words, it's above their capacity.
Right.
They might desire relationship, but their capacity is very limited. And this is a conflict for a person who desires a relationship, but their capacity isn't there. But there's still a collateral damage that happens because
Right.
when they recognize that their desire or their capacity doesn't match their desire, and you could be months, years into a relationship, they end it. There's a collateral damage.
Right.
This isn't excusing the behavior. It's just everybody. I want everyone to know most people don't intentionally hurt other people most of the time.
Right. And that doesn't mean, like you said, that they're good partners just because they
Yes.
don't mean to hurt the other person, right? That's like that famous, of course, saying that the road to hell is paved with good intentions. If you're
Yeah.
not aware, if you're not really mindful of what's happening. And so that's why it's so important. I love how you say in your book that we need to really slow down and pay attention to our intuition so that we can pay attention to those red flags that the person doesn't have a lot of emotional intelligence or that they don't have a lot of capacity to build secure attachment and have those skills, even if they have really loving intentions and you
Yeah.
have an amazing chemistry and you have a really good time with them. And so then you want it to work out and you make excuses for them, but that's then being codependent because you're putting the needs of the other person above your own. And it
Yes.
really takes self-love to pay attention to your intuition. And I love how you describe that in the book. And so do you want to say more about how you know that you have enough self-love to pay attention to your intuition? Like what would you be noticing about your thoughts when you're on that date? Not like, ooh, do they like me? But like, what else would you be saying to yourself?
Yeah. The way I describe it, the way I observe it, a lot of people think your intuition is you're sitting on an airplane and all of a sudden you're getting this, I better get off the plane, it's going to crash kind of thing. And, that's my intuition. Well, usually your intuition isn't screaming at you like
Right.
that.
Right.
Okay. That's usually fear.
Mm-hmm.
Intuition usually comes it's very, just very subtle. And I believe it's binary. It's almost like in the sense of something is off or something is on kind of thing. That's the way I observe. It's like, something's off. Okay. Now, if you don't get a strong, like you just get this feeling something is off, I'm going to use that instead of something is on. Okay. Something's off. Okay. I can immediately go, I'll trust my intuition and not, let's say in the dating realm, I'll disengage versus let me be curious. Okay, something feels off. Let me ask a question to just clarify, because that something off could just be fear or a script or programming going on. Okay. And so I just observed when something, they didn't respond the way I thought they would have to that text message. Okay, that could simply be, okay, something's off. Immediately follow up with curiosity instead of dismissing it.
Right.
Because your intuition is saying something is off. Okay. Now, when something feels good, we oftentimes think that's our intuition. To a certain degree, it is. If it, but we're gonna, if it feels good, see the person again. If it feels good. Now, when I mean feels good, I don't mean it feels good sexually.
Right.
I just mean you feel like you're yourself, you feel safe, you feel comfortable without this sexual lust desire component in there.
Right.
Okay.
Exactly. Yeah. It feels right. You feel like
Yeah.
you can actually be yourself.
Yeah. And so that's usually a good indication when you feel comfortable with somebody very early on. That's a good sign. Now, does that mean it's going to be relationship success? Of course not. Because anything can happen, again. But I believe your intuition just is like, it just will tap you on the shoulder something's off. Just, just now, just pay attention instead of burying your head in the sand. Or like what a lot of people do is they take red flags and they paint them green. They wear rose colored glasses because it's now you recognize something is off, but you're not doing anything about it because you're afraid to disrupt the parts that do feel good.
Exactly. And it takes self-love to be curious, because if you're curious,
Oh God, yes.
and then the person says something that confirms that they don't share your values, then you're going to feel disappointed and all your fears are going to come up. Like, what if you let them go or whatever, and there's not someone better out there? And so that has to be, all of the self-love practices that you teach in order to overcome that. I know you share a story in the book about when you didn't follow your intuition on a date, and then you wound up agreeing to go on a date that you probably shouldn't have, and neither of you had a good time. And then later you implemented that lesson, and the next time you felt that, you had the courage to speak up and in a very kind way share your truth that you didn't think it was a match, and she agreed, and you didn't have to waste your time on a bad date. And so I think that story is really exemplary. I'm sharing it because I know you have to go in a couple of minutes, so it's like I want to know if there's anything you want to say.
That was an interesting lesson. I had a telephone call with a woman, and we had planned a date, and immediately I got off the call. I go, something's not right. And the voice just kept getting louder and louder and louder. But I didn't honor my intuition. I said, oh, there's another script. Hey, you're a dating coach. If you cancel, she might publicly out you, all this stuff. And so sure enough, we went on the date, and minute by minute, it just kept getting more miserable. And it was an expensive date to boot. And I go, a friend of mine said, well, that was a cheap therapy session for you. So the point is I knew something was off. And then that voice just getting louder. And what I needed to do was just take a step back and say, hey, before I could have just taken a step back and canceled, and just then see how that felt. Like, in other words, that the intuition started off just as a tap, but it kept getting louder and louder.
Right. And like, meaning like it didn't feel right, and it felt worse as it went on. And
I had to talk myself into it. And that was a clear sign. If I had to talk myself, like everything about it was just going against the grain.
Yeah. And, I love how you are so vulnerable and sharing your stories, because I think we've all done that. We've all ignored our intuition and done something that we rationalized was a good idea, even though it didn't feel right. And it can be complicated because it could not feel right because of our insecurities too. Right. And so it takes self-awareness to say, is that fear my intuition, or is that my insecurity that I need to work through my limiting beliefs and do the inner child work, like you're saying? So I know that.
Well, let me just end on this note. I was in a significant relationship that ended well over a year ago. And my intuition was saying something was off, but there was this other driving voice that said, like I had these two conflicting voices. One said something's not right, and the other voice said you're meant to go on a journey. And in other words, but like I didn't. It was easier to identify this after the fact. By the way, it wasn't so clear in the beginning. Something's off. At the same time, you're meant to go on a journey. I believe that every experience happens for a reason. I really do believe that. Even bad experiences happen for a reason. And, this wasn't really, this wasn't so much about my intuition, because my intuition said, this isn't right. And at the same time, my intuition was saying, go on the journey.
Right.
I believe when we become more attuned to ourselves, when our vibration of our harmony within ourselves gets attuned, I know today, if that same circumstance happened, because I got the learning lesson, I don't need to do that again
Right. But
because I got the lesson I needed to learn.
that's a
So
beautiful story because your intuition was like, no, this is not going to last forever. And there's some reason to learn from it now. And that's a really complicated message to receive, you know? So I love how you were able
I,
to dance with the nuances.
let me just be clear though. I don't think my intuition said it's not going to last forever. It just said something was wrong. I went in
Uh-huh.
hoping it was going to last forever. So that's where my anxious, my, codependent
Mhm.
personality came into play too. But again, I learned the positive things I learned. How have I healed? What was good? What am I most grateful for? All those play a part in all this.
Yes,
Well,
and
Valerie, I appreciate you. So thank you for allowing me to share that.
oh no, of course. And I love how exemplary you walk your talk because it's obvious in how you share your stories that you're doing all this work yourself. And so people can benefit from your wisdom and hopefully shorten the learning curve for them. So what's the best way for people to connect with you and download more of your wisdom?
Well, my name is listed here on the podcast, so it's Jonathon 𝐀𝐬𝐥𝐚𝐲𝐬. You can Google me. Certainly check out my YouTube channel. I produce 5 to 6 videos a week. I got so much content out there. It's actually very entertaining. I'm a bit more verbose than I am today,
Yeah,
and a little bombastic to
it's
boot,
fun.
and comedic. Uh, but you can go there. You can check out my website. You can check out my social media footprint. I mean, I'm on all of them, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter. You can go and follow me there as well.
Exactly. Yeah. I will put a link to your YouTube below the video and then also in the show notes to the podcast.
Okay.
Because I like your YouTube channel. I agree. I think you're entertaining. And then I know you have some free gifts on there. So people can go there and get more of your information and get more of your wisdom. And so I just think that if everybody in the world knew these wonderful words of self-love and were able to put them into practice, that we would live in a different world. So thanks for
I fully agree.
and I hope that everyone has a self-love filled rest of your day. Till next time.